on, demons. Come on, demons. Come on, demons. Come on, come on, come on, come on, demons.
Good evening, Demon fans, and welcome back to the Demonland podcast. My name is Andy, and our reputation as road warriors has taken a beating as we slump to a 33% win rate on the road this season. In the past 2 years, we won 88% of the matches that we played interstate. Is this just a blip? Is this a sign of a larger problem? Or do we need Mad Max to return to restore glory to this great club? Joining me tonight to figure out why we failed to fire in the gather round is longtime Demonlander George. Good evening, George.
Good evening, Andy. Good evening, Binman. Good evening to listeners. Well, we're all a little bit sad this week, and hopefully between us and the listeners, we might be able to find some answers, or else Andy's MFCSS is going to come back seriously to haunt him.
What do you mean, come back? It's already here.
Haunt
right?
him, infect him.
Also joining us tonight to dissect the loss in the city of churches is Binman. Good evening, Binman.
Good evening, Demonlanders. Good evening, Andy. Good evening, George. And you were less a road warrior than halfway through that second quarter, more a road warrior, I would have thought, Andy. And a bit of a struggle to get the show started tonight. So maybe your preparation, a bit of art mirroring life, or vice versa, with similar for us in our preparation, similar for the D's and their preparation, I should say.
Well, I just got back yesterday, and as we were about to start the podcast, I got into my room where I do the podcast, and I realised I hadn't connected all the equipment up. And in my haste, I hadn't checked everything. I've got a few different computers working, all interconnected, and unfortunately, I didn't check one particular cord to see if it was connected properly, and therefore our theme music couldn't play. So anyway, we're back on track now.
You're not applying for the property manager's job. You're not applying for the property manager's job at a football club, are you?
No, I am not.
You've got to, is it a reason or an excuse, Andy? But you have been travelling a lot. They're sleeping in different hotels.
That's right.
Away from family.
Away from family. I mean, it's not an excuse for having your technical issues there, but it might be a reason. It's sort of life imitating art.
I could be in a loading period.
Yes.
We asked our listeners to provide 5-star reviews and comments on Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcasts, and that we'd read out your reviews on the show. So as always, I ask you to take a moment now, pause the show you're listening to, not if you're listening live, and go and write that 5-star review for us, and we'll read it out next week. Okay, you're back. Thank you. Column D's fan writes, love the show. Only place I can get an in-depth enough review of the D's games to satisfy me. Great analysis from the three lads. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Column. Demonted writes, I have barracked for the Demons since I arrived in Australia in 1986. Never truly understood the game of Aussie rules tactically. Always puzzled by things that turned a game, perhaps because I never played it growing up in the UK, but I discovered the Demonland podcast in 2020, and I feel I now understand the game even better than my Australian-born mates. Great passion for, knowledge of, and insights into the Melbourne Football Club. Keep it up, Andy, George, and Binman. Well, thank you, Demonted. I really appreciate the feedback. If you want us to read out your 5-star review, head over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. Leave a 5-star review and a comment. We'll read it out. The 5-star reviews help boost the podcast for more people to find us and join in on the fun. If you would like to join us on the show tonight to talk about any of the topics we're going to talk about, please give us a call on 039016 3666. That's 039016 3666. I'll answer you, put you on mute, bring you on when we can. During the week, you can call that number, leave us a message. We'll play it on the show. We have 3 voicemails to play on the show, and you'll hear them a bit later on. If you're listening to us live, you can join in the chat room. Head over to demonland.com/podcast. We try to listen, try to read them, read out some comments as we go along. We're live every Monday at 8:30, except tonight, obviously, because we're playing on Monday night next week. Our show probably will be on
every
Tuesday
Monday
night.
except
the last
except the
few
times
weeks.
we're not.
In a few weeks, I think it'll all get back to normal. If you want to listen to us live, join us on Mondays or Tuesdays. Just check your local listings at 8:30 p.m. Head over to demonland.com. You'll find all that information that you need. We'll get into the match wrap-up. I gathered in Adelaide this past weekend for the inaugural AFL Gather Round, and say what you want about the concept, but I thought it was really nice being in Adelaide for this rather unique event. I was staying in the CBD, which wasn't at all far from all the action of Adelaide Oval. Almost everyone in the streets was decked out in footy paraphernalia of all the respective teams. In fact, the only gear that I did not spot the entire time that I was there were the two newest franchises in Gold Coast and GWS. Every other team was well represented. There was quite a nice feeling around town, sort of seeing everyone in all their gear. Adelaide is probably a good spot for this concept. The city isn't too big. It's centrally located. I think having this in Perth, it's too far away, definitely to drive, perhaps cost prohibitive for airfares. Sydney and Brisbane are just not AFL cities, so the concept would not be embraced by the locals like it was in South Australia, and it probably doesn't make sense to have gather around in Melbourne, as there are already pretty much a lot of games of a weekend. Any good feelings I had about the town and the concept of gather around, though, went out the door once our game began. I could tell from the outset that there was something a little off about the Demons, and it quickly became evident that one team was very switched on to play and the other team simply was not. Essendon taught the D's a big lesson. They were a lot sharper by hand and foot, whereas the D's were fumbly and were second-guessing themselves, and this was even before the weather affected any of the skills. And then later, once the rain came, the Dons were playing the wet conditions, kicking off the ground and thumping it forward to gain territory, whereas we continued to play as if the conditions were dry. And to me, it's baffling that this is the second time this season that we have not attempted to adjust to the slick conditions that we knew were coming. Clayton Oliver, perhaps Ed Langdon were just about the only ones that could hold their heads up high after the game. Clary was once again superb as he amassed 41 disposals, with 25 being contested possession, which brings his tally for the season to 88, 4 ahead of Patrick Cripps and 14 ahead of Matty Rowell. Our defence was an absolute shambles in the absence of Jake Lever. The Essendon tall forwards, using their resting rucks, were marking everything, and the small to medium forwards were mopping up everything from our defensive errors. Tomlinson, who came into the side to replace the injured Lever, had a game he'd rather forget. Of our tall defenders, Petty was probably the best with 12 intercept touches after spending a good chunk of time off the ground. Essendon's resting rucks continued to take contested marks. It resulted in about 5 goals, which essentially was the difference at the end of the day. And our defence conceded 100 points, and this is only the second time in 3 years that this rare feat has occurred. Conversely, we could only manage 9 marks inside our 50, and our ability to score was severely hampered by Essendon's defence, and once again, it was all too little too late when we tried to change things around. Ruckman, Brodie Grundy, had a day he would also rather forget, and he was resoundingly beaten by Draper and Phillips. His defensive game was called into question too, as his opponents were able to drift forward and take marks and hit the scoreboard. The return of Max Gawn could not come soon enough to assist the rucks and around the ground, as we were well beaten in the air too. Our tackling game, which we praised last week, was significantly down as well. We were averaging 64 tackles a week, and this week we only managed 55, whilst our opponents laid 71 tackles, and they were a lot more fiercer. They were hungrier than us all match. They came to hurt us, and they did. Our tackling inside 50 was down too, from 14.4 a game to just 10 this week. During the 53-minute scoring drought between the second and final quarter, the Demons' pressure rating of 172 saw us lose clearances by 4, inside 50s by 5, and contested ball by 5. And, well, this was a game that we'd all like to forget, but we must take learnings from this defeat. When we lost to Brisbane a few weeks ago, we were quick to write off any failings in that game due to the effects of losing Max Gawn so early, but perhaps we were using that injury as a shield to mask a bigger issue. What that bigger issue might be, well, hopefully we can answer that question tonight. George, anything you want to add to that?
I don't think that's possible to add anything to that. We were beaten all over the ground in virtually every position. Like you said at the start, that basically the Clary and Langdon were the only two, maybe Jack Viney as well.
Yeah,
putting
Jack Viney. Yep.
But boy, they were just beaten consistently in the defence, in the forward line, in the mids, even in the coach's box. I'll suspect as well. But that's a fairly good summation. So we better dive a little bit deeper and see what was failing in each of the areas, and what we can do about it.
Big man, anything before your stats you want to?
Just as a general thing, I mean, that was leaving aside the big losses at the end of last season, the two finals and the Pies game. That was as frustrating a game of footy to watch, probably since 2020, I reckon. And it had some echoes of 2020, because in that year we were implementing some new game plans, some new strategies, and there were games in that year where we just didn't look on the same page. Sometimes where we made errors that it looked like we weren't drilled. It wasn't, it wasn't sort of instinctive what we were doing, and that happened a few times. I thought, where they were a bit caught between two stools, so to speak, in terms of whether they attack or whether they go back to a defensive game plan. I'm not sure of the question whether you're. There's one in the thread from D's in October who sort of touches on that. Did you grab that question?
Well, it came in late, and I did see it, and it was sort of, I'd already done all of our notes and all that, so I didn't include it. If you want to touch on it now and it's relevant, I can pull it up and read it out, and you can go, because the only reason I didn't include it, I did like it, but I just thought I'd already done all the notes. So Deezy in October says, thanks for the podcast. Lots of questions already, but if you get time, one aspect of our premiership year that I thought was crucial was our ability to wrest back control of games when things got out of hand. We seemed to have a real focus on playing different tempos to respond to what was happening in the game, positive and negative, i.e. capitalise on momentum when we had it, slow things down periodically when the opposition had a run on, know when to go all out and when to take a breather and recalibrate. Do you think that's something that's lacking at the moment? And if so, is it a standalone thing or a symptom of other issues, leadership, ? Or perhaps are we prioritising something else that fits better with the 2023 game style we're trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, my view is that it's not a major issue, but the reason why that it came to my mind, that question, is because, that was a key part of our game. When we're playing well, that controlling the momentum and slowing the game down when the opposition, I mentioned that last week about momentum. We've done that a couple of times this season, so it's still something obviously we look to do. But I think when you're under pressure and you're not playing well, and you're implementing a new game plan or tweaks to the game plan, not a new game plan. It's hard to, you lose some of those things, exactly like D's in October sort of noted, that we might have otherwise done ordinarily in a match like this, where, we never seem to slow the ball down. I said that during the game to someone. We never seem to slow the game down and try and sort of control the speed of movement. But I think, a lot of credit has to go to, I'm sure we'll touch on this through the show, but a lot of credit has to go to Scott. I thought he coached super well, and a lot of credit, there's big talk afterwards about us not being, un-Melbourne-like. It was mentioned 4 or 5 times in the press of that question. I think credit where it's due. Essendon played terrific. They played with all the energy we didn't have, they played with. And I thought Scott had a great night in both the planning, in planning for the game and the execution on the night. Everything seemed to work. It was one of those nights. But, the way that they stretched out tall defenders and isolated them and pushed Francis up and Draper up often together into the forward line really, really created problems for us, exposed some weaknesses, which he identified going in. It really exposed the big one is, and I'm sure George will touch on this in a sec, but it really exposed not having Maxi there, because Maxi would have fixed some of those structural errors just because he's so brilliant at reading the play and getting back. So I gave Melbourne a mulligan in the Brisbane game. There's no mulligan in this one. I think there are a lot of factors. It's a bit like my joke before about, I think there's reasons, not excuses. I think that's important. So there are lots of reasons why we didn't play well. But some of those reasons are down to planning and preparation. So they can't really be used as an excuse. Just a final comment. It's interesting because Brown came out, Lever came out. There's arguably Brown could have played by the sound of it. There was heaps of talk last year about why don't we rest players? Why don't we bring players back in? We've got all of these players at Casey. Why take a risk with anyone? Which is all well and fine, except there's a downside to it sometimes. We really missed Ben Brown's height up forward. Our structure was weakened because of it, and that was exacerbated with Lever going out as well, obviously. So it's not always as simple as, well, why don't we rest it? We saw one of the problems is that we didn't replace what we needed to replace with him. So yeah, that's it was a really, really frustrating game of footy to watch, and the least enjoyable game I can recall since 2020, apart from the back end of last year.
Well, tonight in our stats files, Bin Man, you wanted to touch on the key stats for players on game day, in particular time in forward half and contested possession. But I think you were struggling to find the time in forward half stats. So what do you have for us?
Yeah, so last week I talked about that. We defined that pressure rating, and we also discussed how critical it is for our game plan, but really for all game plans, that you are applying, the teams are applying masses of pressure. We also mentioned last week, we'll be able to tell 10 minutes into the game whether we've brought the sufficient pressure. And to be honest, I was worried 10 minutes into the game. As Goody said in his presser, we were bloody lucky to have a lead at the end of the first quarter, and one of the few times in the last few years, I had no confidence at halftime we were going to turn that game around. And it was on the back of the pressure. So we talked last week about the pressure gauge.
But I also thought early on they were very lucky. They got a lot of easy free kicks. I'd love to get some of those free kicks in forward line. So yeah.
I mean,
I did have those concerns at halftime.
It was one of those nights. Even the commentators said it multiple times during the game that they everything that could go right did go right for them. Everything that the Spargo getting concussed because he ducked his head himself was an example of how that game was looking. What a weird way to get injured. And we had multiple players free the ball. All we needed to do is get that ball on. We would have scored. My dog's going bananas at the moment, so you can probably hear that through the.
That's all right.
But so last week we talked about the pressure gauge and pressure more generally and the importance of it. Now that data is champion data, and no doubt the club uses that data for analysis. For example, periods in the game, post-game analysis. So looking at points in the game where our pressure might have dropped, or looking at individual players' pressure rating when they're doing their match review and their individual match review. But on game day, that's obviously way too much information for the players to absorb. And of the last handful, probably the last 6 or 7 games I've watched directly on the wing at the MCG, as I've mentioned before, looking down at almost directly above the interchange bench. And they write the boards that they come out and show the players with the stats on them. And they're the key stats that they want the players to absorb quickly. So obviously they can't go into the pressure, all of that palaver with, the pressure rating. But on game day, to keep things simple, every time I've seen that board, it's got the same 2 things at the top. Now, I'm not entirely sure I can't remember whether the other stats is about 8 stats that they show on the board, and my feeling is that there's always these 2, which is time in forward half isn't the first one on the board, differential and contested possession differential, and I'm pretty sure there's always tackles on it. I've been to Casey a few times last season and gone out to the huddle, or a couple of times last season gone out to the huddle, and the same information's on those boards as well. Always at the top is time in forward half and contested possession. I can't recall which one's top, but my feeling is time in forward half. And for me, that's our game in a nutshell, and that's what they need the players to absorb really quickly. And they've got a green arrow when we're our positive differential, and a red arrow going down when we've got a negative differential on those. And in some ways, both of those things are an outcome stat, if you like, or an outcome data of what happens when you apply pressure. It's like that's what Melbourne will have good time in forward half when our pressure levels are at the right level, and of course our contested possession differential is almost a direct sort of indicator of our pressure. So they're sort of outcomes of that pressure. And as I said, those two stats are always on the board at quarter time and three-quarter time, and they're always at the top. And when I've watched Casey, it's the same data. In this match, so the players would have seen, at the end of the match, but at quarter time it was, and three-quarter time it was trending the wrong way. Contested possessions was 157 to 152 their way, obviously. So you mentioned that before. By way of comparison, we were plus 21 against the Eagles after that match, but a better comparison given the strength of the opposition is the Swans game, who have got really impressive contested differential numbers. So that's probably a better comparison. Is that game is we were plus 34 in contested possessions in that game. I looked, and for the life of me, I couldn't find the time in forward half stats. I'm guessing it's a champion data stat that they lock up, which is just so frustrating. It's not exactly a proxy, but the closest data I can find is meters gained, which reflect getting the ball forward. So it's got an element of that time in forward half. On meters gained differential, we're number one in the AFL by a mile. We're plus 574 over the opposition. Meters gained miles ahead of the Swans, who are in second place, and they're 447 meters gained. So it just shows the way we play footy. Again, I couldn't find this data about the meters gained in this game either, but Goody implied in his presser we were down on time in forward half, so I'm presuming we're also down on our normal differential around metres gained, or at the very least not as dominant as we normally are. And the other thing, as I said on that board, they always have tackle differential. I'm pretty sure that's always there. Our season average differential on tackles is plus 5.2, but in this game we were minus 16. After minus 6, they laid 16 more tackles than us. After laying 79 against the Eagles, we only managed 55. That's 24 less tackles in this match on a day that ended up getting wet in the second half. So you'd think there'd be more ground balls, therefore more tackles to their 71, which is really a shocker. So on that board, there would have been alarm bells ringing on the board at quarter time and three-quarter time. They don't have this on the board, but to top it off on the pressure stats, the 1%ers were 58 to 42 their way, which is 16 less pressure acts. It just shows you that, not only weren't we on, they were on. It was a terrible performance pressure-wise. And those two numbers, time in forward half and contested possessions, would have been way off. So the players would have known right through the match they were off. And just quickly around some outcome sort of data about poor pressure, we came into the match as the hardest team to score against from turnover, but the Bombers killed us in that area of the game, generating 8 more scoring shots from intercept possessions and outscoring us by 33 points from turnovers. That's just nuts for Melbourne, because Goody mentioned that in his presser. When we're up and about, when we're getting winning contested ball and getting the ball in our forward half and trapping it in there, we kill teams on scores from turnover. And the other interesting one that, again, is, I think, pressure related and really speaks to why it's not as simple as saying, well, the defence were down. It's an all-team defence. Is if you're not applying pressure, the ball goes in there more easily. It's harder to, easier to isolate your defenders, and it's easier to kick to the forwards' advantage. They had 4 players who had more than 15 disposals with a disposal efficiency over 90%. Ridley, Durham, Jaden Laverde and Dyson Heppel. We had none. No player who got more than 15 possessions had a disposal efficiency of 90% or above. So, that all of the pressure indicators, all of the outcome data from not applying a pressure, all was their way. And, in a way, that was the game in a nutshell. I think we just weren't, switched on, whatever you want to call it. We just didn't bring enough pressure into this game of footy.
Yeah, absolutely. I can agree with that. And let's hope it's a blip and not a trend, because that's definitely something we don't want to see repeated. Each week we ask Demonlanders to post their questions and comments in the week's podcast thread on Demonland, and we always read them out and answer them on the show. If you're not on Demonland and you listen to the podcast, then what are you waiting for? Head over to demonland.com, sign up and join in the conversation. In addition to asking questions for the podcast, there's a plethora of other conversations about all things D's related. If you really want to ask a question but aren't on Demonland, shoot us an email at demonland@demonland.com with a subject question for the podcast. You can also leave us a voicemail, 039016 3666, 039016 3666. Don't worry, nobody answers, so you don't have to talk to a person. Mandy Lorian asks, just on the gather round, what did you make of the crowd for the match? Given that the game was a double header, most of the crowd was always going to consist of Port supporters for the second match. Andy, last week you called this headline that was on News Corp. The headline is Gather Round Sold Out Claims Exposed by Vision of Empty Seats. And this is the article. The AFL's inaugural gather round is often running with fans being treated to 4 games so far during the round 5 spectacle. Unfortunately, it was the 5th game of the round that exposed one of the league's biggest talking points. Keen to show just how big a hit the first instalment of gather round is, one of the major points of emphasis was drawing fans from all over to every single contest. When all 9 games were listed as having been sold out, the trumpets could be heard ringing out from the AFL headquarters. That all fell apart, however, when footy fans flicked on their TVs for the late Saturday afternoon contest between Melbourne and Essendon. Despite both teams holding 3-1 records and sitting inside the top 4 on the ladder entering the round, the fans failed to flock through the gates for that encounter. As the cameras panned out ahead of the opening bounce, empty seats could be seen as far as the eye could see. Adelaide Oval has a capacity of more than 53,000, and while the early conditions saw rain falling, the images of the stands show that those figures won't be in any trouble. Footy fans didn't hesitate to point out the blatant issue with the AFL's ticket claim. Nine Network's Nat Ionadis wrote, "The AFL has an odd definition of a sellout." The Advocate's Alex Fair wrote, "There's a lot of empty seats for a so-called sellout." And then the article ends like this. Port Adelaide and the Western Bulldogs will play straight after the Demons and the Bombers match comes to an end. The AFL expected fans to be in attendance for the second game of the doubleheader, with Port Adelaide fans buying a significant portion of the tickets. So,
Who wrote that? Who wrote that article?
I have no idea, but the Mandalorian goes on. Whilst the article is calling out the AFL for claiming that all 9 games are a sellout, when clearly they are not, but it's also taking a dig at the D's and Bombers as if they couldn't fill the stadium. What did you make?
Peanut, whoever wrote that.
Yeah. What did you?
News Corp.
Yeah. What did you make of the crowd? It sounded as if the Bombers had more fans there. Should the D's and Bombers have had their own standalone game? And when I was walking around the mean streets of Adelaide on the morning of our match, I did notice a lot more people were wearing Bombers gear than Demons gear, and that's not to say that there weren't any D's fan there. It's just that we were noticeably outnumbered around town. That was confirmed once I got to the ground, and the Robbo, Libby Birch equivalents at the ground were talking and doing their warm-ups of the crowd, saying, "Let's hear some noise, Bomber fans," and "Let's hear some noise, D's fans." And, you know, given that there was a doubleheader and Port with the other match, there was always going to be a significant portion of the crowd for the day that were only interested in that match, and the majority of that crowd would filter in during the latter part of our game. As a result, the crowd that was present at the start of the match was much smaller, and the crowd that was there, I reckon we were outnumbered 4-1, as evidenced by the roars and cheers when each team was asked to make some noise before the game. It was very clear that there were more Bombers fans, and you know what, that's fine. And fine, and I get that the article was trying to call out the AFL for their claim of all 9 matches were sellouts. I just didn't like the inference made by some of the commentators in the media online that tried to make out as if it was somehow Melbourne or Essendon's fault that there were empty seats. I think the AFL probably should have made it so that either there was a standalone game on another day or even earlier in the day on Saturday so that they could clear the stands and prepare for a later game. I was saying to George before the show, maybe they could have had our game at 1 o'clock, got everyone out of there at a certain, an hour or two after the game and had the other game at 7 o'clock. They probably could have, and sold 2 tickets for the day. rather than the one.
What a non-story.
No, it
These
is a
fans don't
non-story, but
travel to the Docklands, let alone to Adelaide.
I know, but look at the Friday night crowd. There seemed to be a lot of Sydney and Richmond people in the crowd, as well as what I noticed around town. They filled out the stadium.
We can't help but get knocked for our crowds.
And the other thing, the important thing is, Andy, we were being followed by Port Adelaide. They had access to tickets at the same time as what we did.
No, I understand that aspect. I'm saying we should have had a standalone game. Or if they do it again next year, which we know they are, well, they've got to share it around and maybe we get a standalone game.
And how many do you think an Essendon Melbourne game at the MCG would have drawn?
Yeah, well, it would have drawn more than that.
Yes.
But no,
exactly,
that's not about. I don't mind that. I knew that was going to happen. I just didn't like the inference. I think they were taking the dig at Melbourne and.
Didn't like the inference from news.com, I think. Let's move on.
Leave it at that.
All right. Let's move on. We had a lot of questions from our listeners in regards to our backline. So rather than double up on a few of the questions, I'll read them all out and then get back to you guys for your opinion on what happened down back. Lazy asks, is there anything we can do if our no-fly zone defence concedes 15 marks inside 50? Travi 14 adds, very concerning the amount of marks taken 40 out directly in front of goal. Was the defence totally out of sorts? McQueen adds, may look lost without Lever. And we do have a voicemail from Noah from Bentley about the defenders. I'll play that now. Then, George, you can jump in with your take on what went wrong with our defence.
Hi, guys. This is Noah from Bentley. Love the podcast. Was very disappointed with our loss to the Bombers and just wanted to get the perspective from all the guys as to whether we really think that Melbourne just lacked the mojo and we were just outclassed on the day, and do we think it's just a one-off? And my main question is, the real concern is with the tall forward that the Bombers had and the youth that they had was defenders just outclassed on the day. Would like to hear your opinion, and go Jays.
Yeah, a little bit to take on there.
Apologies, Demonland listeners. We had a situation where my mixer just restarted itself and we lost a small section of audio where George was answering Noah's question. That audio has now been lost forever. We now return to the rest of George's answer.
But really, I think the problem was structural. The absence of Jake Lever, who plays that intercept spoiling role, wasn't replaced by Tomlinson. Now, for those who've watched Tomlinson play at Casey, he plays the Stephen May type role down at Casey, who's the full-back goalkeeper type of role. And unfortunately, in this game, I think he tried to play the same role, which wasn't what was needed. We needed the Lever type to come overtaking, leaving his man to create the spoils to avoid Essendon getting those, easy marks, which resulted in 5 goals between their two ruckmen for the whole game. It also wasn't helped, with Petty being off the ground for quite some time as well. I think he was doing concussion protocol or something else. I'm not quite sure, but he was off the ground for a good time. So all of a sudden you're left with a back line that's just not operating as to its optimum. Stephen May certainly misses the presence of Lever. He's got a specific role in the side to fill. When that role is not being replaced properly, then things do tend to fall apart. Are we back on the air again, Andy?
We're back. I'm not sure what happened then.
Okay. Yeah, so if this continues in some way, shape or form, the structures down back fell apart. I think the addition of Lever, and it sounds like he will be back this week, keep our fingers crossed, things will start to work again. And this is exactly the situation we saw at the end of last year when we had numbers of injuries to critical players in critical areas. The systems fall apart and it looks really bad. Things just don't work. And that was the case here in the back line, I think. But I suspect it was also the case in other areas of the ground in this particular game. But we'll talk about that a bit further.
Yeah, and then, I mean, I'd add that a couple of things is, like I said before, is we weren't putting enough pressure on that inside kick, inside 50 kick. So, that was really not helpful in terms of being able to, get our defence set. But the big thing was that the lack of pressure meant that we weren't slowing their ball movement off the halfback flank at all. Like the way that, if you think back to that Sydney game, Sydney are very, very similar in the way they played at Adelaide, in the way that they move the ball off halfback flank at speed, and obviously Collingwood are doing that as well. We couldn't slow them down at all, and like you don't have to stop them necessarily, but pressure slows them down, and if you can slow them down enough, that brings in your intercepting players. That's Lever isn't taking those intercepting marks if the ball isn't slowed, or at the very least the person kicking the ball inside 50 isn't under a heap of pressure, because they don't have time to they have to stay one-on-one. When the ball moves really quickly, everything becomes one-on-one, and that's what I said before. Scott did a brilliant job of isolating us. That was really helped by the fact that they were able to move the ball at will. Like we were just, that we just weren't running on top of the ground for whatever reason, and so we weren't providing that pressure. I thought Tomlinson got really exposed. I said after the Saints practice game, I was really disappointed in his game. I watched down to the end. He played in that second part of that game, not even in the sort of seniors. He was outpointed a number of times by, I think it was maybe that Philippoussis guy, or in any case, he was outpointed by a young player, and he looked a little, his weakness is one-on-one. He's not great, and he lost his rhythm completely. He not only made some mistakes one-on-one, got outmarked, but he looked a bit rattled after. There was one where he dropped a clean mark down in the forward pocket, 5 metres out from goal, was lucky enough to have a chance to redeem himself, and then proceeded to handball it straight to the opposition, and they scored a goal. It was that sort of night. But the other big issue, George, I thought was Grundy, is that, structurally you're spot on, but, Maxi is more that it's just not just a structural issue. He, as we've talked about lots of times, he reads the flow of the game brilliantly, and when to position himself defensively. He's always done that well. And Grundy was all at sea. Both defensively, he was outmarked a few times. He didn't seem to know when to run to the right spots. It was pretty tough on him, though. They were really worked him over, didn't they, the opposition, which was clever again by Scott. Scott deserves a lot of credit for, the way that he targeted our weaknesses. So I think it was not – there was a number of factors that led to our defensive struggles, and Goodwin's completely correct. That's exactly how I felt. It felt like every time it was going in there, they were going to mark it, let alone score. I think it's when you get that all team running, that all team pressure, it's a different situation completely defensively. The other thing is, I thought Steve May just about had his worst game, probably since the end of last year, when he was struggling with his back, but he. A couple of times he didn't bend down. I know it made me think about whether his back has got an issue or.
Yeah, he didn't look healthy, did he? But I think we didn't see the Stephen May role being able to be played as well. That was the other thing that he was trying to cover, perhaps.
Yeah, well, another clever thing they did is is drag it, using Stringer to drag May back to the goal square. I thought was clever, because really it meant that May had no influence on the game almost at all.
That suited Stringer beautifully, because that meant he didn't have to run anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Or it didn't matter that he didn't get any possessions. They could say, "Oh, he played a defensive forward role." The first time defensive has been used, and Jake Stringer.
At the end of the day, he kicked 5 goals the previous week and got 9 touches this week.
Exactly.
So Stephen May did a good job in that respect. But everything else was falling around him. So you can't do much about that. But just all these structural problems, hopefully, will be fixed with the return of. With the right people in the right places, like Max and Jake Lever, all of a sudden things will start to look better, I'm sure.
And the other thing about Grundy is that he had a bit of a mare in some respect. He played, his numbers actually look all right, but he made some funny decisions. And I wonder whether part of it was he was feeling like his the opposition ruckmen were having the better of him. Certainly were up forward. They were kicking 5 goals between them is a pretty handy return for your 2 ruckmen, isn't it? So it almost felt like he wanted to do too much to.
Yeah, I thought he was run into the ground basically over the course of the game. He's playing against 2 ruckmen, and he's barely got onto the track over the pre-season from where he was at Collingwood. He will get better as the season goes on, but he was run up and down the ground, and unfortunately the coaches didn't bring, for example, the Tom McDonald in and to assist him until what I thought was too late in the game. So. He got a really rough stick for the whole game. I was surprised how well he did stand up considering the circumstances.
Yeah, and as you pointed out before, he's not really a traditional ruckman, even aerially. He's not. His one wood isn't his aerial strength and contested marking. It's his ability to keep running and going. But I know there was a couple of times where he ran and did brilliantly, and then elected the handball, and you could see the forwards didn't know what they wanted. Should they lead? Should they drop back?
Yeah.
Both times it ended up turning the ball over. So it was just one of those nights, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was frustrated a few times when he did that, and I thought, just kick the bloody thing, And I think he just elected to handball, and yeah. Also, just on Grundy, he came to the club, and the whole deal with him and then Max was going to be rucking 50-50, playing forward with Max out of the team. It's thrown that completely out, and now we find Grundy's having to run all over the ground. And as you said, they sort of exposed that, and it didn't.
And it's worth noting in that context, Andy, is that our 2 losses are both in situations where the opposition have had 2 ruckmen.
Yep.
We lost Max early, Foot, and the other Brisbane Lions ruckman dominated. And in this game, it was 2 ruckmen to 1 and they dominated. So again, it sort of speaks to George's point about the structure, but it's ironic that exactly as I said, that was going to be our big reveal, was having our two ruckmen dominate. And in fact, in the 2 losses we've had, it's when the 2 ruckmen opposition to our 1 has been a huge factor.
Buck Naked says, it seems that we have a number of specific defensive roles, including that of fullback and intercepting back, May and Lever. Tomo did okay when he took May's role early in the year, but panicked when he had to play Lever's intercept role. If not him, obviously, then who do we have as a Lever Mark II for when the glass ankle strikes again? For me, if Lever either doesn't get up this week, or if he goes down again with another injury, I'd be bringing in Disco Turner. I think we've given Tomo enough chances, and I think he probably can fill maybe May's role, as Buck Naked said earlier in the year he did. But I think with Lever's role, I think maybe Disco Turner needs to come in. I think we need some new blood in the side. It's been one of the criticisms of the footy department in the past 12 to 18 months. And yes, Hunter and Grundy have come in, but they're senior players brought in for specific roles. And I guess with the exception of McVie, now Van Rooyen as well, we haven't seen new blood for a while. Other teams are blooding new players all the time. I think it's time we showed some faith and rewarded some good form at Casey. So, yeah, I'd like to see Disco Turner perhaps replace Lever next time he is out. Got another voicemail from Noah from Bentley, just on Harrison Petty.
Hi guys, this is Noah from Bentley again with a second follow-up question. Just wanted to get your opinion on Harrison Petty. The last couple of weeks, he's been in the forward line and hasn't really, done much as a true forward. And yes, he's not naturally gifted as a forward. But this week, watching him in the back line, felt that he really got outdone by the Bombers. Just wanted to know everyone's opinion to think whether he needs to be dropped this week, or do we just keep on with Petty? And wanted to know your opinion with the Richmond game, whether we need someone like Hibbert who's a bit more experienced in the back line. Now that we've
listening
got
to the sounds of silence
a little bit longer, I just wanted to know your opinion about our defence and where you think it is at. Love the podcast and go D's.
Big man, you were saying you couldn't hear that, and you probably can't, because I think there's something wrong with that mixer, it was recording on our end, so our listeners of the podcast will hear that. Probably people live wouldn't have heard that question, but I will. I'll answer it anyway. Just as a note to any listeners, because you would have noticed a bit when we were talking about defenders earlier, my mixer crapped out, and we would have lost a tiny portion of the show. So when we do get back, live, when I release the show, I'll make a note of it for anyone listening that a portion of the show was lost to time. But just in regards to what Noah said about Harrison Petty, I have to totally disagree with what you said, Noah. I thought he was one of our better defenders. I think I mentioned that he had 12 intercept possessions. The past few weeks he has been thrown forward, which isn't his position. He's been training in all summer and playing in for the past couple of years. And I don't think our backline has been settled at all this year, with May being out for the first couple of matches, Lever being out, Petty playing forward, Hibberd in and out, Tomlinson in and out, Salem out. There's been nothing settled about our back six, so it's only natural that there'll be some hiccups, and I wouldn't be dropping Petty. Tomlinson will be out of the side first, in my opinion.
Yeah, Petty's he has a habit of getting banged up though, the poor bugger, doesn't he? Pretty much every last half dozen game he's played, he's been smashed from pillar to posts, and it looked like he was. Ironically, he seemed to play better after he came back from his injury. Just defensively, George, the other player that I actually was going to mention last week but forgot about was Bowie. I thought he was pretty average against the Eagles last week, and I thought he was really poor in this match. He lost some one-on-ones, and he just didn't look his normal self, and I thought he had an average game.
Yeah, probably have to agree there, but I put it down to what his role is in the side, and when he doesn't get the support that he normally gets from people like Lever and create the opportunities for him, then his game looks pretty ordinary as well. So, and I think we also missed Hibberd in a big way, the bigger body and those defensive efforts that he seems to pluck out of nowhere that keep on saving us. And we really struggled all round with this. But I think that's enough of the defence. It didn't work.
It didn't work. That's right.
All right,
after giving Gus a rap last week, he didn't have a great game either. I didn't think so.
We'll get into different positions in the field. Nairobi Demon says, grateful for the panel's comment on the lack of pressure and run through the middle. It seemed we just couldn't go with them, and they had spare players everywhere. They just waltzed through the middle and could enter their forward 50 with little pressure on the ball carrier, thus asking the impossible of our defence. The question is why? Reading between the lines of Goody's presser, he acknowledged that they would review their preparation during the week, but he seemed to suggest that he didn't think that there was a reason for why he didn't look like Melbourne. I don't buy the missing player argument, and I don't think Goody was entertaining it either. A game should still look like Melbourne, even with a few missing players. Indeed, that is why we have Casey playing with the same approach. If it's not preparation, not missing players, and not niggles so early in the season, it must be effort/attitude. Even if you don't fully agree that attitude was an important explanation, I'd be curious for the panel's thoughts on what concrete actions the coaches can take, particularly when it's not about the performance of one or two individuals, but seemingly most of the squad. You arguably can't just single out one or two players and push them back to Casey, and you also can't dump half the squad. But at the same time, surely some accountability is necessary if a ruthless culture is to be built and sustained. Sorry, this has turned into a long question and commentary, so feel free to weave into the discussion as you see fit.
Definitely, the point about the midfield and the pressure is exactly right, and that's what I said before. When your pressure's down all over the field, the defence are the one who cop it because it ends up being a scoreboard. And to be honest, we were flattered with the scoreboard. It was, 65 points or something like that at halftime? That was defensively just a horror show, really. But you can't put it all on the defenders, so it's easy to blame them for for giving up a score, but really it's that all-team pressure. But just that question around, I don't agree that it's as simple as, I don't think it's an attitude thing. But there's a question later about that I'll speak to a little bit about the preparation. It's an holistic. It's more than one element. There's a lot of things at play. There's a lot of moving parts, and there's a question later on about the sort of, I think from El Diablo or around the mental aspect of it. I guess so I'll talk to that later and make sure that I remember to come back to Nairobi Demons question. But again, I've said this last year a few times. I find it really, this is not directed at Nairobi Demon, but frustrating how it seems to me people are happy to accept or to think in a generalization that, they're mentally not on today, or that, that it's a mental issue or an application issue or an effort issue, or they weren't switched on, or they took the Bombers easily. It's so fuzzy. The mental psychology stuff's so fuzzy, yet some people, seemingly forever and a day in footy, people are prepared to accept that. But if you then bring in preparation and things like travel and 6-day break and sleep and food and those things, no. Despite the fact that the science is clear in that space and not very clear in the psychological space at all. And what I would say is the two things can't be seen in isolation. One affects the other. Players' mindset and psychology for a game is impacted by things like their sleep, their diet, their preparation, how long they've been on a plane, how many nights they've been in a hotel. All of those things play into it. So, but yeah, there's a question later. I think that, as I said, I'll try to sort of link back to Nairobi Neiman's question.
All right, we'll get onto the forwards. Delightful Play says, no goals from the 10-minute mark in the second quarter. Cozzy's second goal until the second minute of the fourth quarter. I think Track kicked a goal. And a range of behinds by the end of the game. Not our most accurate this season. Would you please discuss our forward setup for this game? Big man, what was your assessment of that?
Well, again, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg thing, because you could focus in on the forwards, but really, again, I know I'm banging on about this, but if you go back to what the players are shown at quarter time and 3/4 time in forward half and contested possessions, those two were way down. And what that means is the opposition score more and we score less. So the ball wasn't coming in waves. We weren't outnumbering the opposition. It's all about outnumbering the opposition at the fall of the ball. Goody talked about it, touched on it really briefly in his presser, and David King was talking about it. I heard a bit of the thing he does on Waitley on the Monday morning about contested, and we've talked about it. Post clearance contested possessions is almost the most important stat in some respects. The top 5 teams are the top 5 teams on the ladder. He was saying this morning around post-clearance contested possession. Of course, that's another stat you can't find anywhere. It's a champion data stat that's locked up. And so when you don't apply that, your forward line are going to struggle. I thought it was, they all played poorly in some respects. How much that is because the ball wasn't coming in quick enough for them, or it wasn't, we weren't getting free players forward of the ball. That's an open question, but it's important to remember we are number 1 in the AFL for scoring at the moment. We've lost 2 games and still number 1 in the AFL for scoring by some margin. So lots going right up forward. In this game, Tommy Mack had a bit of a horror show as well. He couldn't clunk him, but he's not really the clunking type. And, the other factor I thought was Van Ruin got a pretty rude welcome to say, well, this is AFL footy. He didn't have a good game. And, I mean, what he did do well was compete and bring it to the ground. But again, that's great. That's fantastic. But unless you've got players applying pressure and winning that post-clearance possession, and when it hits the ground, well, it doesn't really matter if you bring it to ground if you can't apply forward half pressure and you're not getting crummy goals. That was totally exacerbated by losing Spargo for a self-injury. So, I think that you can't look at this game in isolation and go, well, there's an issue with the forward line. Again, people last year were complaining we weren't scoring enough. We're number 1 in the AFL by some margin for scoring this year. So, you can't have your cake and eat it too. The other big issue, of course, was BB not playing. So, as George has noted, structure is critical to how we play football. It is for all teams, but particularly us. And our preferred forward line model is 3 talls and a resting ruckman. We didn't have a resting ruckman, and we had 3 talls. We didn't have BB in there, so we didn't have our 3 tall set up. So, structurally, our forward line didn't look like it should look and normally would look. And on top of that, you lose Spargo out of the rotation up forward. So yeah, looking at it in isolation, I don't see that there's an issue. Again, the scoring is off the charts and they're kicking accurately as well. We're number 1 for accuracy from set shots. So, we're doing a lot right up forward.
Oh My D says, like the thoughts on the panel on whether Shaki would have been a better replacement for Benny Brown than Melksham against Essendon. Josh has kicked 9 goals, 3 behinds in his 3 VFL games, so we kicked 4 this week, and offers a lot as a second ruck too. Do you think he has a chance to play against Richmond, especially if Gawn doesn't get up? Now, I'm not sure how close Benny was to playing this week, if he was ever going to play at all. We speculated last week that perhaps as a result of the inclement weather forecast that perhaps he would not play. They cited the back issue. I would have liked Shaki to have had a look in. He can fill the backup ruck role that Weed would have filled. This is a scenario probably where Weed probably would have played and would have been given a game last year. I say release the Shaki. As to whether he gets a game against the Tigers, I guess it depends whether Gawn gets up or not. Look, I don't know. Given the Tigers' ruck stocks are low, I don't think we'll be seeing Shaki this week, even if Gawn does get up.
I think the other thing against Shaki coming in, we'll talk about this a bit later on, is that Ben Brown is available.
Yeah, that's
hopefully.
He trained today at the open session. He looked reasonably free, and they were quite positive about him coming up for this week. So, but Shaki certainly put his hand up at Casey. He had 3 goals to half time and 4 for the game, and he really stood out. He was working hard, which is what we want to see, working hard up the ground. So once again, the selectors will have a problem in that area. But yeah, missing Ben Brown was a big factor, because the other thing that is happening is with the forward line is you're depending on those 3 talls to bring the ball to ground. More so than we ever have done. Other teams are doing the same thing. It's the small forwards who are kicking lots of goals these days, and then when you take one of our small forwards out in Spargo, and Melksham doesn't provide very much at all, you really start to struggle, and that's exactly what we did in this game.
Yeah, no, that's a good question about Shaki, because coincidentally I said that to a friend yesterday, exactly that. In hindsight, I didn't think of it before the game, but in hindsight, I think they missed a trick not bringing Shaki in, exactly for what we were just discussing. Structurally, he would have been a better option than Melksham. Yeah. Melksham defensive forward. We didn't need a defensive forward. We needed a tall forward, because that's our structure. And I think it was a mistake not to make him an emergency, and a mistake not to select him. Particularly because he'd been in reasonable form at Casey before this week, and as you say, Andy, he's done some rucking as well. He's 24, 25. Yep. Better him rucking than, JVR, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
And just one other thing about being more aggressive. We were more aggressive with our kicks inside 50, and we were kicking into the corridor more. The problem with that model is that if you aren't taking the mark and your ground pressure is poor, is that you're losing the ball in the central corridor, which is perfect for a team like Essendon, who loves to run fast from the half-back flank, because they're not running from the pocket. They're running straight up the middle of the ground. And as we've talked about, they've got 3 options then. When they win the ball in the middle of the ground, 20 metres out from our goal, they can choose to go the right lane, left lane, or straight ahead. And they cut us up all night doing that. So it's not, it has a double effect of not bringing the ball to the ground well enough. And then when it does hit the, intercept marks, and when it does hit the ground, when they win it, it's in the central corridor, because that's how we've tweaked our game plan.
El Diablo asks, can we discuss the mental/psychological side of footy? I can't understand why the team is a roller coaster in terms of their approach to every game. Some games we start with the right attitude and intensity. Other games, like yesterday, we seem to be flat and going through the motions. Is this something the coaches are responsible for, or is it the players? The old fart agrees. Good question, El Diab. I don't think we can blame the wet conditions, the consecutive road trips, or the absence of a few players for the way that we played in Saturday's loss. To my eyes, we were just never switched on. Plain and simple, how can this be? And BW511 explains on this, I think teams are going after us knowing we are fragile. If we don't have our leaders in the side and in form, we can simply crumble. We've got systems in place that are very solid if on our terms, but it seems we keep flirting with the line of what's sustainable. I'm not convinced we have the right balance. Do you think we can reach the point where the team harmony and game plan can click for long enough period to have a shot at this year's flag? I think that's a $64 billion question. Big man, do you have the answer to our psychological problems? Big man, you're on mute.
Mute.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Yeah, I touched on that before. It frustrates me to a degree the preparedness of footy fans to default to it's a mental weakness or somehow it's on the players. I'm not saying that we weren't necessarily switched on. I'm saying it's a complete holistic. There are multiple elements at play. And to default to thinking, well, the players are somehow fragile, mentally fragile. One, it's an insult on the players. Two, it's just not accurate, and it's not taking in the full picture. And I disagree with old D as well around the notion that you can't blame the consecutive 6-day or the consecutive travel and the 6-day break. Again, there's a difference between looking for reasons and making excuses. But there's 100%. Goody talked about it. He was asked about it in the presser and he answered it, that it was, of course, a factor. Scott mentioned it in his presser that he was aware of that, and that was a factor in his planning for this game. The fact that we were coming off a 6-day break. We had 79 tackles last week in Perth against West Coast. It was a tough physical game, a 6-day flight. So if you think, the impact of travel, as you know, I've been punting for a long time now, and one of the bets that I bet on footy is the total match point. And I've been looking at the impact of travel for a long time because I've got a financial benefit in doing so. There is 100% an impact of 6-day break and travel. But, one of the things that's important with that is that not all, in terms of breaks, in terms of like 6-day break, they're not all equal. So it depends a lot on whether they travel or not. So, for instance, we flew into Perth on Saturday. Hotel and the rest of the palaver, all of that palaver after, a 4-hour flight. Got the red eye out of Perth on Sunday night. I don't know, this is one of the questions that I've got. A 4-hour flight, then what? An Uber, all the players grab an Uber from the airport and go
probably
home.
have a bus or something to get them to their car or, whatever.
So, or some such, whatever, meaning the players would not have been home on Monday and hit their beds till what? Something like 5 a.m., best case scenario, 6 a.m. So Monday's pretty much a write-off. You asked the question, a great question of Selwyn Griffith about the impact of sleep. And he said it's a huge factor. It's a massive factor. So Monday morning, where the players are in bed at 5 a.m., they sleep till, get the 5-6 hours and wake up at midday. Monday's a write-off, both in terms of the sleep pattern. You can't do any training.
And then you feel like shit for the rest of the day too.
They feel like shit for the rest of the day. So that's Monday. Yeah. On Friday, 4 days later, we fly out to Adelaide. Yeah, it's a short flight, but still was a time killer. By the time the players leave home, get to the airport with plenty of time to spare, they get a bus to the hotel, the second hotel overnighter in less than a week. So heaps of dead times at the airport, waiting for buses, transport to the hotel, long drives back to their own home once they're back in town. So leaving aside the issue of physical recovery, of recovering from the game, and if you listen to Viney's post-match interview on the Melbourne website, he talks about what they'll be doing this week is recovering. His first thing he says is recovery. That's what we'll be doing. So leaving aside the issue of the physical thing of only having a 6-day break and so having a limited amount of time to recover just time-wise, a full day and a half of that is taken away from them. So essentially it's only a 4.5 day recovery from a match. And of course, for 9 hours in a plane. So Melbourne to Perth, Perth to Melbourne, and Melbourne back to Adelaide. So in a week, under a week, 6 days, they've got, 7 days, they're 9-10 hours in an aeroplane. Can't be very good for recovery and preparation, particularly for players like, the Talls who are coming up from. And again, we had a match with 79 tackles last week. So physically a very demanding match against the Eagles. And of course, all of the kilometres that they have to run. So a 6 day break, not involving any travel and they're both if they're in Melbourne, means there is much, much less of that dead time. So it's a much less impactful. So the back-to-back travel was a big factor. Of course, players will still struggle to come up physically if they have a 6 day break in town, but not having to do all of that travel, being able to sleep in their own beds, not having all the dead time is much less taxing in a holistic sense. So given all of that, for me, an error. I mean, I'd love to ask this of Selwyn Griffith, and he touched on the challenges, didn't he, in that interview we did with him, Andy, about the 6 day breaks. He explicitly said it's a huge challenge for them to organise all of the running they have to do, their GPS numbers, all of that stuff is a huge challenge to work through on these short day breaks. Whilst of course this would be hard on the families, it seems to me it would have been more logical for them to have gone straight from Perth to Adelaide and spent the week in Adelaide. Perhaps they could have stayed in Perth on the Sunday night, obviating the need for the red eye. Everyone gets a decent night's sleep, fly to Adelaide Monday, and then they all have that opportunity to sort of rest up in Adelaide. So for me, that might have been the preparation that Goody was touching on, that they will look at all of those elements. But to me, they are all big factors in the game. It was said multiple times by commentators, in the presser, by Goody himself, and even by Scott, that we weren't ourselves. Surely all of that palaver is part of the picture. And all of that palaver affects the psychology of players as well. So that's what I mean. It's not as simple as one component. They all impact on each other.
Well, we probably maybe in Perth should have stayed at Joondalup and tried to recreate some of that grand final magic. George?
Just a couple of things. Not only was the travel a factor, I think, in this game, but we've now played 3 out of 4 games interstate, which is a hard travel schedule in anyone's book. It was interesting also that Tom McDonald, in the interview after the Perth game, said he wasn't going to come home on the red eye. He said he wanted to stay in Perth because it enables him to recover, get a good night's sleep, and then come back. So I think that's a fair summation from someone who's been doing a lot longer than the rest of the side due to his age. It was interesting today at the open training session, Alan Richardson also said that they'd look at the situation again. So I don't think you'll see something like this being repeated. The fixture is what the fixture is at the moment. But he said there was a pressure from a lot of the families because we'd travelled 3 times in 4 weeks to spend some time at home with family, and they wanted to get back, and that's perfectly understandable. But as Ben Man said, physically it probably did them no good as a result of that.
So
that's a really good point I forgot about the Brisbane. So when you add that in, that was an emotionally draining game, psychologically so draining, but also physically draining because of the humidity. Then we backed up and played the Swans in a taxing physical game and travelled to Perth in a taxing physical game. So again, none of that's an excuse. Goody made the point, didn't he, of saying we don't make excuses, but if you're going to review things and look at them, they're all factors, and that's what Goody said, is that we will look at the of how we plan this and how we could mitigate it in the future. And I suspect that the way that they would do it is to stay in Perth overnight and fly to Adelaide and not come home.
And I will say that the Perth game, and I hope George is okay because it looks like he's coughing up a lung. I don't mean to laugh. Take some water, please, George. I will say the Perth game was, it was probably about 24 degrees and the sun was shining the whole day. So it was would have been quite taxing in that regard. I guess if you're playing in that, I mean, it's not like a 30-degree day, but it still would have been taxing in the heat. So that adds to it too. What do you make of, we've got the 9-day break now for ANZAC Eve, but then we play North Melbourne off a 5-day break on Saturday night following up that. Do you think that's going to be a factor? I know it's in Melbourne, they're not travelling or anything. And you can bet you Alistair Clarkson's going to take a leaf out of Scott's book and try to
it'll be a factor, just not, like I said, not as like a 5-day break when you're staying in Melbourne isn't as big a deal as the multiple travel. The other thing that I would say is that this season there's going to be lots of volatile results. And so that question around, again, I bristle at the thought of Melbourne, being fragile. I just think that that's, since when are we fragile? Like, it's just doesn't hold up to scrutiny, on the back of one performance, or you could say, well, there's two. But there's going to be lots of anomalous results this year, in part because the model of playing fast and going fast means that logic suggests that is a much more taxing way of playing than, for instance, the way we were playing in the first half of the season, where there were huge chunks of the game where we were controlling the speed of it, or the opposition weren't even coming at us. The game is just super fast at the moment. Again, that's going to be more taxing, which means that, one, it's more taxing and more difficult to recover. But Collingwood, as I flagged last week, like, they could only score 60, 70 points in this game, and such a high scoring team. That's, if they start running out of puff, and there'll be times when they have a short break, or, they're fatigued or whatever, their game plan, so's Essendon's and so's Sydney, and increasingly ours, is incredibly dependent on multiple players being able to run. If you don't have them, the game plan falls apart. So there will be lots of games where, there already has been. There will be lots of upsets because the game plan is so influenced. So many teams' game plan is influenced by aerobic and capacity and fatigue. So, we won't be going, we'll lose other matches against teams that we shouldn't through the season for that reason, as will Collingwood, as has already happened this season.
Well, Tarek's Club sort of talks about this, the travel. He seems like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde have flipped the script this season. Comfortable at home, woeful away. Is there still time to rectify the onset of travel sickness? Well, I think we've answered this. Or will Demon Landers be reaching for brown paper bags? In the intro to the show, I mentioned that the last 2 years we've had that 80% win rate on the road. This year we're 33%. B-Man's mentioned the mitigating factors. We've got 4 more interstate games this year, and I'm including the trip down to down the Princess Freeway to Cardinia Park. So I think we travel to Tasmania at some point. We play Adelaide, or we play Port in Adelaide, Geelong in Geelong, and we must have another Sydney in the last round.
Alice Springs.
Oh yeah, I didn't do Alice, so that's another one. Add another one, a taxing one.
And just on the question about our premiership, is that if I was framing a market, I would have us as clear favourites to win the flag. But the actual market is Collingwood $4.50 to win the flag, and us to $5 to win the flag. So this talk about whether it's a mirage or we're not, money talks, and we're $5 second favourite for the flag. I think that's about right in terms of where we are, of our probability of winning the flag this year. Of course, that doesn't mean we will, but that's I think a pretty true odds of the probability of us winning 4-1.
Gaundy the Great says, ruthless is a strong word to describe teams. We were ruthless in 2021, partly by way of our system and team buy into the plan and desire to lift the cup, but mostly the effort was also unquestionable. It was there every game, 100%. I think everyone put an asterisk on the Lions game due to Gawn and prevailing conditions. After what we dished up against Essendon, I'm thinking this is now the emergence of a new trend, and I think it's not all just about effort/attitude, but more or less executing the new game plan. We are not yet comfortable playing the kamikaze outside, uncontested, through the corridor game plan. It's a bit like trying to work in a change of golf swing. The rehearsals look and feel great, but when you feel the heat, you fall back on what you know and in your comfort zone. My hope is that, similar to the Cats last year, it will take some time to click and we'll have ups and downs, but ultimately hit our straps when it matters most. Getting back to our best 22 is always a bonus too. George, are we having difficulties adjusting to this new game plan? What's going on?
I don't think our game plan's changed all that much, surprisingly. I think it's the various factors that are going into it are the problem, particularly with the Gawn situation. We've thrown Grundy into the ruck, who was never expected to be the first ruck effectively. You've got midfielders now having to learn to play to his style of rucking. It's very, very different to what they're used to and the delivery they've been getting from Gawn for the last 4 or 5 or 6 years. So our mids aren't getting the ball in the same way that they used to. So there's a lot of adjustment going on, more so than what we expected after Max went down. Things look good when everything's running well, particularly out of the middle. They're just not happening at the moment. Bin Man's talked about the lack of contest, the lack of work coming from the mids. It was particularly evident in this game, but I think you'll see when we've spoken about it, when the right pieces are in the puzzle in the right positions, everything clicks beautifully. You start taking away those critical people and those critical pieces out of the whole structure. The structure tends to fall apart in a pretty big way. So I don't think we've seen a dramatic change in the game plan. There certainly has been a change with a lot of other clubs, the way it's being played. Collingwood, Sydney, Geelong, to quote Chris Scott, I was actually mentioned by Alan Richardson today at the training session where Chris Scott said they had to change their game plan to beat Melbourne. So that's exactly what teams have been doing. It's a much faster running, quick entry into the forward line type of game plan. We started it, or maybe Richmond started it when they were at their peaks. But they're constantly adjusted and altered. But I don't think there's a dramatic change with what we're doing compared to previous years. There's a slightly different way of entering into the forward line, but pretty well every team in the competition is adopting that model at the moment. It's kick it long into the top of the goal square and make sure you've got a line of defenders defensive forwards, blocking the exits that were there in previous years. So things have changed, but I don't think all that much for us. But we've got to have the right people on the field.
But I mean, they're definitely there's been a shift in terms of using the corridor more and changing lanes more. I would agree that's not a major change. That's more of a tweak. But in this game, that sort of question is that we didn't take that on. We didn't, and that's what sort of I was touching on with the question from Dees in October is that, we went back into our shells a little bit and we didn't really have the ability to go down the line. We weren't winning those aerial contests, but we weren't taking off the kick to the corridor or the high-risk kick either in this game. So that's what I meant before is we're sort of caught between two stools a little bit in terms of, should we counter-attack? When we did a counter-attack, they opened us up because we weren't applying the pressure. The other sort of change to the game plan a little bit is forced on us by more teams coming at us quickly, like you're talking about, George, because that's meant some changes defensively. We're less able to create a zone. We have less time to set up a zone. So therefore our intercept numbers are, a bit different. And the way that we intercept is a bit different. In this game, as I noted before, we just didn't put any pressure on the ball carrier. We didn't slow the ball down at all like we did against Sydney. And so it was coming in, like you said, super fast, no chance really to zone off and create that zone. Even sort of Gus wasn't really playing that role well. And we were exposed one-on-one.
We've got Mo Sislak has left us a voicemail in regards to Goody and our footy department. So I'll play that for you now.
Evening, gentlemen. Mo Sislak here from Mo's Tavern and the band The Mo Sislak Experience. Simpsons watchers will understand that reference. Fellas, thanks for donating your time to the podcast. Absolutely love it. I think you have the right balance of banter and deep analysis. Really appreciate the time and effort you put into it. Even though I don't agree with everything said, no one can argue that the three of you bleed red and blue, and for that, we absolutely love you. On the footy, question for the three of you. I'm really wondering where Goodwin and the coaching group come into the loss on the weekend. Look, I still believe a side like the Bulldogs in some ways were hampered by the 2016 flag. It sort of stagnated their development and innovation. Goodwin's a premiership coach, so deserving of our respect. No doubt, I think he's an excellent man manager, has great relationships with the players, calm and controlled, has developed a fantastic culture. But our question, is he a great strategist and in particular a good game day coach? I think he was really outcoached in last year's final series and outcoached on the weekend with the moves made, such as the way Bombers used their rucks and pushed us wide and took over the corridor. I think last year we stagnated a little in terms of strategic development and innovation, and we're a little too similar to 2021. This year, I think we do too little too late in some games and are too rigid in our structure and our game plan. Compare this to how sides like the Filth, Collingwood, Bombers and the Saints, they've all evolved. I understand we've been pretty successful, probably more successful in those teams in the last few years, but I still don't think we maximise our strengths, cover our weaknesses or change things up when momentum isn't going our way. The weekend was a perfect example of that. We didn't do much when things weren't working out the way we wanted it to. Over to you boys to discuss. Love the podcast. See you, fellas.
Coaching isn't down to one person these days. It's down to a multiple of people in the boxes. You'll see in some games, there's 9 or 10 people hiding up there with computers and all sorts of things. However, in this game, I was disappointed in what Grundy was expected to do. I think he was simply run into the ground. We should have been using, I thought, Tom McDonald right from the first quarter as a backup ruck. You can't expect Grundy to be taking on one ruckman after the other, and then run around the ground. It's not surprising that he's not a great aerialist at the best of times, but you can't expect him to be doing that much in a game. So Van Rooyen only had a limited amount of time. I think I saw him at one ruck contest in the whole game. But it's difficult during the game trying to make changes. It's not like the old days where you throw someone from back to forward. We even did in this game. Petty was up forward for a short period to get time again, then thrown down back. So he was trying a few things, but I think there are bigger factors at play in this game, and throwing the chess pieces around wouldn't have achieved all that much.
We move on to Queen Bian Demon. Says, I imagined the 2021 Premiership would cure the MFC SS forever. It's back. Please advise a remedy. And Queen Bian Demon, unfortunately, MFC SS can't be cured. It only can never go into remission. For any new listeners, MFC SS or Melbourne Football Club supporters syndrome is that veil of negativity or that dark cloud that hovers over most long-suffering D supporters who are of the belief that nothing good or positive will ever happen for us. Many, like Queen BN Demon, thought that the 2021 Premiership would cure us, but I warned everyone that MFC SS truly never goes away. It's always been there. The victories just take the edge off, but it always comes rushing back with a vengeance after a loss. The flag just made the losses a little more palatable for a time, and my prescription is pop in the 2021 Grand Final DVD, watch and repeat. And that might just put a Band-Aid over any losses that we suffer. Let's get into the Casey portion of the program. Casey retained top spot on the VFL ladder with a 40-point win over Essendon. James Harmes returned to the footy field and was outstanding with 32 disposals and 5 clearances. Josh Shackey followed up his strong 3-goal performance last week with 4 goals to go with his 19 possessions, 8 marks, 7 hitouts and 3 clearances in a dominant performance. Laurie put his hand up for season senior selection to replace the concussed Charlie Spargo with 32 disposals and 4 clearances. Dunstan picked up 24 posies and kicked a goal. And our other leading possession gatherers were Woden 22, defender Disco Turner with 20, who was outstanding, and Blake Howes 19. George, do you want to add anything quickly as you watched the match?
No, just a couple of observations. Firstly, Essendon has only lost one game this season, so there was a little bit on the line with it. We finished up with a 41-point win, and Casey were, out of their regular players, were missing Munro and White. Somebody else I can't remember off the top of my head. But there are a lot of Casey players who sort of have never seen before. They're dragging them out of the second sort of levels to fill the numbers. I think we had 12 AFL listed players playing on the day. What was also interesting, Shaki was playing very well and doing rucking as well during the game. But also the interesting thing was they were trialling, obviously, various people in the middle. Seston was tried a couple of times. Woden was tried in the middle a couple of times. What we're seeing is the development of these younger players into roles and seeing what they're capable of doing at Casey, which is a great position to be in. Laurie was particularly prolific. Harms was as well. His kicking is not all that good still, so that hasn't improved in this game. But Laurie was certainly put his hands up. He's starting to get a lot more of the ball on the outside and using it very, very well in tight situations. So that's pleasing to see. So, yeah, he'd be a good chance. The other interesting one is watching another Casey player, Bell, who's the ruckman. He was sadly beaten in ruck tap-outs in this game, but around the ground he's gone from as what some people might describe as the giraffe on ice skates to someone who knows what they're doing and really starting to power around. But keep your eyes on him for when mid-season drafts and things like that come up, or even in next year's drafts. He's learning to be a footballer down at Casey, which a lot of them are.
Well, let's get into changes. Brown, Hibberd and Lever could all be in the frame for a return this week. And given the 9-day break, Max Gorm may come into selection contention. Laurie, Harms and Shaki had a day out for Casey and have put their hands up as well. Supreme Demon says, with Charlie Spargo unfortunately getting concussed, should we give Bailey Laurie another go at AFL's level in the senior side or leave Jake Melksham in the team to play that role? B-Man, thoughts?
I reckon it's a real like for like. That seems to me be, particularly. I saw about 10 minutes of the Essendon game, the VFL game, and it was pouring for rain. We were down in that quarter, I think, and it was so. I'm surprised that we ended up winning by 41. The weather must have cleared up, I'm guessing. But if Laurie's had a good game, it seems to me he's playing midfield mainly for Casey, isn't he, George?
Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah,
32 possessions this week, 35 last week, I think. So yeah, he's racking on that.
So even though he's not, it's not a like for like in the sense that he's hasn't been playing that high half forward role that Spargo does. You'd think he could come in and play that role, relatively comfortably. It's not really the role that Melksham's playing anyway. So I could definitely see him coming in for Spargo. The other changes that I'd be looking at, from listening to the presser, I would be really, really surprised if Maxi doesn't play. I would be less surprised if Lever doesn't play though, and which is a bit of a worry. I'd be surprised if Brown doesn't play as well.
Are you sorry? Do you think Lever will play?
I'd be surprised. I would. I think Gawn will play.
Yep.
I think there's a chance Lever won't, and I think Brown will.
Well, someone who was at training today, Lever did train, Hibberd trained, Gawn trained, Ben Brown trained, all with the main group. Interestingly, Viney was in the rehab group, so I'm not sure what is wrong with him there. So the possibility, the possibility he's not playing unless they're just sort of resting up the knees. He's got a longer break until we play, so he might still get up. But
he wasn't listed as an injury, though.
No, he wasn't. But Lever wasn't listed as an injury last week either, and we sort of knew he wouldn't be playing. So forget who's listed.
No, he wasn't listed as an injury post-match.
Neither was Lever last week. So
Lever certainly trained today.
He did train
freely,
but someone who was listening to Alan Richardson talk to the group of people that were there, they were I was invited as well. Anyone who was a 10-year member got an invite down to training today for that session. I couldn't make it, but someone who was there said that based on what Alan Richardson said, they think it'd be highly unlikely if Lever plays. I mean, he didn't come out and say he wouldn't, but he just didn't sound confident. But said Max sounds like he will play.
Yeah, I was there, and Lever was running very, very freely.
Oh, he was?
So, yeah, I'd be very surprised. I'd be more worried about Viney.
Yep.
He's got that horrible knee strapping on one of his knees. And he was doing separate works with one of the physios away from the main group for a good portion of it.
So what's if he doesn't play? What do you think's happened? Who do you think's going to replace him? Or just go with who's?
Yeah, it certainly opens up the options for Laurie as well. You know, if he's not used as a forward, and you might be looking at some other options. So Lever, Gawn, Hibbard is another one. Whether it sounds like he's over the worst of the Achilles. Harms, of course, is being pushed again from below. So he, if Viney isn't available, then Harms becomes another option. But we may see a number of changes this week, particularly when we've got the 9-day break between the two games. So there's plenty of time for these niggling injuries. The Hibbards, Levers, and even Gawn to just get that little bit more recovery. So I think we might see a number of changes coming in this week.
If Lever let's say Lever doesn't get up, I think both what will happen, hopefully, and certainly what I would do is Tomlinson out and Disco in.
Yeah, Disco in. Yeah.
I mean, because he was really average, Tomo. And, I don't normally, at one point I couldn't help but yell and, in frustration, but it's, his game was poor enough to warrant being dropped, and definitely Disco, if he's played well, would come in. It's got, that's quite a few changes potentially. I did Hibbo in for, go to Dusty. He's, that's the role. So that would be huge to have him back. I agree with what George said before. I really think we missed a bit of that physicality that Hibbo brings, a bit of that physical energy. So I think he'll come back in. They'll be really keen to get him back in particular because, he'll go to Dusty. And I think that Max will come in and Brown will come in. So that'll be interesting where that leaves JVR. And I reckon they might drop JVR, rest, manage, whatever you want to call it, send him back. He's had a good crack at it. He knows what the level is now. Didn't have a great game, I didn't think was competitive, but had 2 kicks or something for the match. It didn't take many marks.
And we were always, we were quite excited to see him, but we did put the caveat that we temper your expectations because he's not going to be, every week. We were very happy with what we saw at training and everything, but
Sorry, Andy. That said, T-Mac didn't have a great game either, so they might end up sticking with JVR and dropping T-Mac.
Yep.
And we've said a couple of weeks ago there'll be rotations between those three during the whole season, and I think this might well be the one of the rounds where it's happening. Brown was certainly moving very freely in the training session today, and of course the question that we posed earlier on is, do you bring Shaki in for this game? So there's four in the mix for those 3 positions up forward at the moment.
It would be a shame not to see JVR at the G on ANZAC Eve to some degree, wouldn't it? I have fond memories of Hogan having a fantastic game in, I think, maybe his first season against the Tigers in that game. And I'd love to see JVR have that opportunity. But a bit will depend on how they, where they land on T-Mac's game, I think, in terms of maybe there was, of course they'll have all the data on the GPS number and the impact, all the stuff that we're guessing about, they'll know about, at least have some background on it. So I think that will be it'll be a really interesting selection come Thursday night, particularly given Thursday night's 5 days or 4 days, whatever it is, before the game. So they'll announce a squad, obviously, which won't really give us much greater insight.
The other thing is JVR is carrying heavy knee strapping seem to be from training last week. He had it in the game this week. He's training with it again today. Doesn't seem to be hindering him in any way. He certainly was involved in all of the drills. But again, if we're looking at resting players and somebody's got a niggling injury, particularly a young player, here's your opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the game. The Tigers have lost 3 on the trot, and their season could hang in the balance with 1.5 wins from 5 matches. Losses to Collingwood by 15, the Bulldogs by 5, and the Swans by 44 have plunged the Tigers to 15th on the ladder, needing a win on ANZAC Eve to stay in touch with the 8. The Tigers' big man stocks have taken a hit with injuries, with both rucks, Toby Nankervis and Ivan Soldo, unavailable. Forward Tom Lynch and defender Robert Tarrant are also unavailable. Supreme Demon asks, what do we need to do to beat Richmond on ANZAC Eve, big man?
One word, one phrase.
Pressure.
We've got to bring the pressure, basically. If we bring the pressure, so same comment as last week, we're a miles better team than Richmond. If we are on our A game, which means that we go back to what I said before, forward half, time in forward half and contested possession, the outcome stats, if we bring it, that's the number one thing we'll need to do to beat them. They're going even faster, Richmond, than they were. They're like us, they're a territory. They also have those 2 same metrics, and the other metrics the coach Hardwick uses as well as Goody is the contested possessions, post-clearance contested possessions. Really similar teams, the way we play, though Richmond are playing even quicker than they were last season. The problem for them is that they've got too many poor kicks. That model really does need good kicks, like the player of the kicking skill of a Goulden, for instance, or the crazy skills of Pendlebury and Dacos at Collingwood. Richmond have got a lot of average kicks, and so that model is susceptible anyway because of their poor kicking, but super susceptible if we can bring the elite pressure that that we should be bringing. I can't, 9-day break, ANZAC Eve, big game. I will be very shocked if we don't bring the intensity. Again, we'll be able to see 5 minutes in where we're at with that, but I'll be really, really, really disappointed and shocked if we don't bring the sort of intensity and pressure that is our hallmark, really. And if we do, Richmond are in struggle town at the moment, and particularly when you take out the player Tarrant and Lynch. Talk about structure, that's and then their ruckman. I mean, they've got bigger structural problems than we have. Particularly if Gawn comes back, we'll have the 2 rucks to run them into the ground. So, all things being equal, if we bring the pressure, it could be a bad night for Tigers fans and a good night for D's fans.
Yeah, they're also missing Gibcus and Graham as well. They might get back Jaden Short this week, but that's a doubtful one. And the other thing, at the game in Adelaide, Cochin was subbed off.
Cochin, and he's a shadow, isn't he?
He is a shadow, and so is Martin.
They're
just shadows of their former selves. Their whole back line's being held together by Grimes. They're in serious trouble. From the soldiers' point of view, as you said,
they were in that game into the last quarter. They weren't that far behind, and then all of a sudden it was bang, 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 bang.
Yeah, but that game was a shocker to watch. It was an awful game to watch. The skills were just appalling on both sides, being played between the 2 half-back lines for the majority of the game because nobody could hit a target.
And that's a huge, exactly, that's a huge problem. It's a big, that high risk kick to the corridor means you got to hit the targets. Otherwise, we sweat on turnover. We mentioned it before. Essendon killed us on turnovers because we weren't hitting targets. If we're switched on and Richmond go aggressive and turn it over, we'll smash them on turnover.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there for tonight. We'll be back next week on Tuesday night following the ANZAC Eve match. Thank you to our 5-star reviewers, Colum and Demonted. Thank you to our voicemailers that left us the message. Thank you to Noah from Bentley and Mo Sislak. Thank you to our posters on Demonland who submitted questions and comments. Thank you to Mandy Lorian, Lazy, Travi14, McQueen, Buck Naked, Nairobi Demon, Delightful Play, Oh My D's, El Diablo 14, BW511, D Old Fart, Tarax Club, Gaundy the Great, Queen Bee and Demon, RPFC and Supreme Demon. Your questions form a huge part of this show and take a little bit of pressure off us in preparing content for the show. So thank you. Thank you to my co-hosts, George and Bimman. Thank you to you, our loyal listeners. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts whenever or wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll read it out on the show. It really helps to spread the word about the podcast. See you next week. Go Demons.
Go Red Leggers.